My name is Julia, and I never imagined my life would take the twists and turns it has. Growing up, my family seemed ordinary enough, at least to us. Dad ran a window frame business, always busy but dependable, while Mom managed the house. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Dad rarely brought work home. He'd come in late, give Mom a quick kiss, ask me about school. And that was the extent of it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was happy in my own little bubble. Then everything changed. I was 22, fresh out of college, and unsure of what to do with my life when I overheard Dad on the phone. His voice was tense, almost angry. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you take over my company. I've worked too hard for this." The words stopped me in my tracks. I knew I shouldn't be listening, but I couldn't pull myself away. My stomach twisted as the conversation continued. Dad's business was in trouble. Why hadn't he told us? That evening at dinner, I watched him closely. On the surface, he seemed normal, joking with Mom about her overcooked pot roast. But I noticed the worry etched into his face. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I didn't know much about running a business, but I was determined to help. The next day, I started digging. It didn't take long to find out who was behind the threat to Dad's company, a well-known businessman named Robert Caldwell. His office was close to our house. I didn't think twice. I walked into Caldwell's office building and asked to see him. The receptionist gave me a look that said she thought I was crazy. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her eyebrow arching skeptically. "No, but it's important." "Please, just 5 minutes," I pleaded. She sighed but eventually made a phone call. After a short conversation, she waved me toward the elevator. "Top floor," she said curtly. The ride-up felt agonizingly long. When the doors finally opened, I found myself standing face-to-face with Robert Caldwell. He was older than I expected, with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to size me up in an instant. Well, he said, his tone bemused as he looked me over. "What do we have here?" I swallowed hard, mustering all the courage I had. "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Julia Thompson. I'm here about my father's company, Thompson Windows." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Thompson's daughter? Now, this is interesting. Come in, let's talk." I followed him into his office, trying not to gawk at the impressive view from his massive windows. He settled behind his desk, which seemed to stretch forever, and gestured for me to take a seat. "So, Miss Thompson," he said, his tone calm but curious. "What can I do for you?" I took a deep breath, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "Please," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside me. "Don't take over my father's company. It means everything to him. There has to be another way." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his piercing eyes fixed on me as if he were sizing up a business deal. "Interesting," he said slowly. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Thompson. I'll leave your father's company alone, on one condition. You marry my son." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "Excuse me?" I managed, staring at him in disbelief. "You heard me," he replied, his tone unwavering. "Marry my son. He needs a push to grow up, and I believe you're exactly the person to give him that. Do this, and your father's business remains untouched." I walked out of Caldwell's office in a daze. Marry his son? The idea was absurd. It felt like something out of a soap opera. But as the hours passed, the weight of the situation began to sink in. What other option did I have? Watching my father's life's work crumble wasn't an option I could live with. The next day, I found myself back in that imposing office. Caldwell was already waiting, a smug look on his face, as if he knew what my decision would be. "Well, Miss Thompson," he asked, "what have you decided?" Taking a deep breath, I squared my shoulders. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll do it. I'll marry your son." Caldwell's face lit up, and he clapped his hands together. "Excellent. Let me introduce you two right away." Before I could fully prepare myself, he led me into another room. And there he was, Caldwell's son. I'd expected someone stiff and overly polished, a reflection of his father. Instead, I was met with a tall man with messy dark hair, a crooked but genuine smile, and a casual air about him. "Hey," he said, stepping forward and offering his hand. "I'm Jack. You must be Julia." I shook his hand, doing my best to mask my surprise. "Yeah, that's me." Jack's father cleared his throat loudly. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted," he said before stepping out and closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Jack's relaxed demeanor faded. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed heavily. "Look," he said, his tone apologetic, "I'm really sorry about this. My dad. He has some pretty old-fashioned ideas about how things should work." I shrugged, forcing myself to appear nonchalant. "It's fine," I said, trying to convince both him and myself. "We're adults. We can handle this." Jack let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, sure," he said, shaking his head. "Just your everyday casual arranged marriage. No big deal." Despite the awkwardness, we ended up talking for over an hour. I hate to admit it, but Jack surprised me. He was funny and surprisingly smart, even if there was an air of irresponsibility about him. It wasn't hard to see why his father thought he needed a push to mature, but it also wasn't hard to see that Jack wasn't all bad. He was interesting. And, as strange as it felt, part of me began to wonder if this bizarre arrangement might work out better than I'd thought. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I entered what you might call a relationship, or at least something resembling one. We went to dinners, caught a few movies, and tried to act like a normal couple. But beneath the surface, there was always this lingering awkwardness, a quiet reminder that none of this was real. No matter how much we pretended, we both knew the truth. 6 months after my first meeting with Robert Caldwell, I stood in a white dress, walking down the aisle. My dad beamed with pride, his eyes filled with happiness, completely unaware of the deal I'd made to save his company. As I stood across from Jack and recited my vows, I looked into his eyes. They weren't filled with love, not in the way I'd always dreamed they would be. But there was a kindness, a friendship, and for now, I told myself that would have to be enough. The reception passed by in a blur of congratulations, toasts, and champagne. At one point, Jack's mother, Elizabeth, cornered me. Her smile was tight, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said. "I do hope you'll make Jack happy." I returned her smile, matching her insincerity with my own. "I'll certainly try, Mrs. Caldwell." As Jack and I left for our honeymoon, I caught sight of Robert Caldwell across the room. He looked utterly pleased with himself, beaming like he'd just closed the deal of the century. A surge of anger rose in me. This had been a game to him from the start. The first few years of our marriage were interesting. Jack and I settled into a rhythm, living together more like roommates than husband and wife. The house, courtesy of his father's wealth, was beautiful. But it felt cold, just another part of the arrangement. I tried my best to be a positive influence on Jack, and, to my surprise, it started working. Bit by bit. He spent less time partying with his friends and more time at the office, learning from his father. Robert Caldwell's pride in Jack was obvious, and for the first time, I felt like maybe this whole arrangement wasn't for nothing. Elizabeth Caldwell, however, was a different story. She never openly criticized me, but her disapproval was palpable. It was in the way she pursed her lips when I spoke, or the way her compliments always carried a sharp edge. "Oh, Julia," she'd say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "that dress is interesting. So brave of you to wear something like that." I'd grit my teeth, plastering on my best smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." Despite the challenges, I clung to hope. Maybe Jack and I could grow into something real. Maybe when we had children, things would change. But life had a different plan for us. On a crisp fall day, Jack and I sat together in a doctor's office, the silence between us thick and heavy. The doctor's voice was calm, but filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said gently, "but the tests show that you, Mr. Caldwell, are unable to father children." The doctor's words hit me like a punch to the gut. No children. The one thing I had hoped would bring Jack and me closer. Something that might make this marriage feel real was now an impossibility. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about my parents and how much had changed for them. Since my marriage to Jack, Dad's business had flourished. His turnover had doubled, and he seemed genuinely happy. I was thrilled for him, but I couldn't help feeling a deep sense of emptiness within myself. I needed more. I wanted to work, to have a purpose beyond being Jack's wife. When I finally brought it up to him, his reaction was immediate and dismissive. "Work?" he said, looking at me like I'd suggested something absurd. "Why would you need to work? We have more than enough money." "It's not about the money," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I want to do something meaningful, something that feels like mine." Jack shook his head, his expression firm. "In our circle, wives don't work," he said flatly. "They do charity. Why don't you start a foundation or something?" It wasn't what I had envisioned for myself, but I needed an outlet. So, the Julia Caldwell Foundation for Children with Cancer was born. It gave me a purpose, even if it wasn't the one I'd imagined. I poured myself into the work with everything I had, planning fundraisers, visiting hospitals, meeting families, and doing whatever I could to make a difference. It wasn't easy, but it felt important. Jack, however, seemed indifferent to my new passion. He didn't ask about my work or show any interest in the stories I brought home. In truth, he didn't seem to care about much of anything I did anymore. We lived like two strangers inhabiting the same house, moving through parallel lives that rarely crossed. The connection we'd started to build in those early months had faded, replaced by polite indifference. I told myself I was doing something meaningful, even if Jack wasn't by my side. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage, which had never been built on love, was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own emptiness. Years went by, 10 to be exact, and then everything shifted once again. Jack's father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Overnight, Jack was thrust into the position of CEO, a role he was far from prepared for. I tried my best to be supportive, but it was clear the pressure of running his father's empire was taking its toll on him. 2 years later, another blow hit us. Jack's mother, Elizabeth, was diagnosed with cancer. "We should move her to a care facility," Jack suggested one evening, his voice detached, as if he were discussing a business transaction. "They can take better care of her there." But Elizabeth was as headstrong as ever. "I will die in my own home," she declared, her chin held high in defiance. Drawing on my years of experience with the Cancer Foundation, I stepped in. I took charge of her care, hiring nurses, managing her treatments, and spending long hours at her bedside. Slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Elizabeth's frosty demeanor toward me began to thaw. One afternoon, as I adjusted her pillows, she reached out and took my hand. "You're a good woman, Julia," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The words caught me off guard, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," I said, my voice trembling. But while my relationship with Elizabeth improved, my marriage to Jack continued to unravel. 5 years passed since Jack had taken over the company, but things only got worse. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was drinking heavily, staying out at odd hours, and snapping at me over the smallest things. Then one day I got a call from his assistant. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but Mr. Caldwell hasn't been to the office in days. Is everything all right?" That night, Jack stumbled home, his clothes rumpled and reeking of alcohol. I confronted him the moment he walked through the door. "Jack, what's going on?" I demanded. "Your assistant called. She says you haven't been to work." "What's happening?" He let out a bitter laugh, slumping into a chair. "Work," he slurred. "What's the point? The company's going under anyway. Dear old Dad left me a sinking ship, and I couldn't keep it afloat." I stared at him, stunned. All those years of effort, the legacy his father had built, and it was gone. Jack, however, seemed almost relieved. Desperate to save him, and us, I reached out to the one person I knew could help. My father, despite being semi-retired, agreed to step in. Jack needs guidance, I told him, practically begging. Can you offer him a position, something to rebuild his confidence? Dad, always pragmatic but kind, agreed to mentor Jack. He offered him a role as his deputy, hoping to teach him the skills and discipline he'd need to turn his life around. It was a lifeline, one I prayed Jack would grab before it was too late. But Jack's heart was never in it. He showed up to work late, left early, and did the bare minimum, just enough to keep up appearances. I watched helplessly as my father's company, his pride and joy, began to suffer. Sales were dropping, and employees were growing restless. I knew I couldn't avoid the issue any longer. One evening, after Jack had had a few drinks, as he often did, I decided to confront him. Jack, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. We need to talk about work. You're barely showing up, and my father's company is suffering because of you. His expression darkened, anger flashing across his face. Oh, so it's my fault now, he snapped. I never wanted this, Jules. Any of it. What are you talking about? I asked, taken aback by the venom in his tone. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. This life. This marriage, he said. I'm just waiting for Mom to kick the bucket so I can sell her house and get out of here. His words hit me like a slap. I stared at him, horrified. How can you say that? I demanded, my voice shaking. Your mother is dying, and all you care about is her money? Don't act so righteous, he sneered. We both know this marriage is a sham. You're just as eager to get out as I am. Disgusted, I turned to leave the room, but as I opened the door, I froze. Standing in the doorway was Jack's mother. Her expression said it all. She'd heard every word. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without saying a word, she reached out and took my hand. The look in her eyes held gratitude, understanding, and deep sorrow. That single gesture said more than words ever could. Not long after, my entire world was shattered. The phone call came out of the blue. My parents' plane had gone down. They were on their way to Hawaii for a second honeymoon, a trip they'd been so excited for. But what was supposed to be a celebration of their love became their final journey. Mom and Dad were gone. Just like that. I needed support more than ever. I needed someone to lean on, someone to help me carry the weight of the grief that threatened to drown me. But Jack? He was nowhere to be found. My husband didn't even bother to attend the funeral. As I stood there at the cemetery, watching my parents' caskets lowered into the ground, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. The people who had given me everything were gone, and the one person who should have been by my side couldn't even show up. After the funeral, my sorrow began to give way to anger. How dare he? How could Jack abandon me in my darkest moment? It wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a betrayal of basic decency. And in that moment, I knew something had to change. Fueled by a mix of grief and fury, I stormed into my father's company. Our company now. Or, at least it should have been. The sight that greeted me as I stepped into Dad's old office made my blood boil. There was Jack, lounging in Dad's chair like some self-proclaimed king, barking orders at an assistant. He looked completely at ease, as though he hadn't just abandoned me in my darkest hour. Jack, I said, my voice tight with barely controlled rage. We need to talk. He glanced up, annoyance flickering across his face. What is it now, Jules? Can't you see I'm busy? Busy? I shot back, my voice rising. You couldn't even be busy enough to come to my parents' funeral. Jack rolled his eyes, dismissive as ever. Oh, here we go with the moralizing again, he sneered. You know what, Jules? Always nagging, always pushing. Well, guess what? I'm done with it, and I'm done with you. His words stunned me into silence for a moment, but then his expression shifted. The anger in his eyes gave way to something far worse. Cold calculation. You know, Jules, he said, his voice suddenly calm and measured. This company is worth about $17 million. And as deputy director, guess what? It's mine now. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling. Leaning back in Dad's chair. His chair, Jack smirked. I've got all the passwords, all the access. Everything runs through me now. I'm in charge, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't do this, I said, my hands shaking. You've already destroyed your father's company. I won't let you do the same to my father's legacy. Jack laughed, a cold, bitter sound. Run it? Oh, I'm not going to run it, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. I'm going to sell it. Piece by piece. And when I'm done, I'll walk away a very rich man. Live like a king. Before I could stop him, he turned to the computer, typing away as I stood frozen in disbelief. Moment latte. I saw the confirmation flash on the screen, a large transfer from the company's account into his personal one. There, he said smugly, swiveling back toward me. That should tide me over for now. Then, as if this entire ordeal were just a minor inconvenience, he casually opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of papers, tossing them onto the desk in front of me. He leaned back with a satisfied grin. Oh, and here, divorce papers, he said, his tone almost flippant. Let's stop pretending, Jules. This marriage was a farce from the start, wasn't it? Time to make it official. I stared at the papers, my mind racing, the weight of his betrayal crashing down like a tidal wave. Jack had taken everything, my father's legacy, my trust, my marriage, and reduced it to ashes. I caught the papers without thinking, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. It was too much all at once, my parents gone, my marriage shattered, my father's company being ripped away right in front of me. I left Jack's office in a daze, the divorce papers clutched in my trembling hands. But as I walked, something inside me shifted. The years I'd spent bending to Jack's whims, to his father's manipulations, to their constant dismissals, it all hardened into resolve. No more. This was the moment I decided to fight back. Fueled by a newfound determination, I headed straight to my father's lawyer, Mr. Henderson. He had been Dad's trusted advisor and confidant for years. If anyone could help me, it would be him. Julia, he said warmly as I entered his office, rising to greet me. I'm so sorry about your parents. How are you holding up? I sank into the chair across from him, unable to hold back. The day's events poured out of me in a torrent. Jack's betrayal, his threats, and the desperate situation at the company. Mr. Henderson listened intently, his face growing more serious with each word. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Julia, he said, his voice steady, I think it's time I shared something with you, your father's will. He made some important updates just before the accident. He retrieved a file and began to read, his words lifting an invisible weight from my shoulders with each passing sentence. The company, it wasn't Jack's to take. It wasn't his at all. My father had left it entirely to me. I sat up straighter, hope flickering to life for the first time in days. But there's more, Mr. Henderson said, glancing up at me with a twinkle in his eye. Your father made another decision just before his passing. He fired Jack 2 weeks before the accident. Dismissed him outright. For a moment, I was stunned. Then, laughter bubbled up inside me. A real, genuine laugh. Something I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. So, all those orders Jack's been barking, all those big decisions he's been making, they're completely meaningless? Completely, Mr. Henderson confirmed with a nod. Then, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. There's one more thing, he said, sliding it across the desk. A letter from your father. My hands shook as I opened it. Dad's handwriting blurred behind my tears as I read his words. My dearest Julia, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry for leaving you like this, but I hope I've left you with the tools to build the life you truly deserve. The company is yours now. I trust you to carry on the legacy we worked so hard to build. And Jules, it's time to let go of Jack. You've given enough of yourself to that marriage. You deserve so much more. It's time to live for you. I love you, sweetheart. Make me proud. Dad. By the time I finished reading, Tears were streaming down my face. But they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of clarity. I looked up at Mr. Henderson, wiping my eyes with a newfound sense of purpose. "Do you have a pen?" I asked,
my voice steady.
Without hesitation, he handed me one. I signed the divorce papers right there and handed them back. It was time to let go of the past and build the future my father believed I deserved. Without hesitation, Mr. Henderson handed me the pen. Each stroke of my signature on the divorce papers felt like shedding the weight of years of unhappiness. "Can you file these for me?" I asked, pushing the papers back toward him. "I want this done as quickly as possible." He gave me a reassuring nod. "Consider it done." As I left his office, a sense of freedom washed over me. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in my entire life, I was truly in control of my own destiny. No more Jack, no more manipulative Caldwells. This was my fresh start. On a whim, I pulled out my phone and dialed Sarah, my best friend from the Charity Foundation. "Sarah, it's Julia," I said, my voice lighter than it had been in ages. "Want to meet for coffee? I've got some news." An hour later, we were sitting at our favorite cafe, lattes steaming in front of us. "So," Sarah said, leaning forward with curiosity, "what's this big news?" I took a deep breath, then let it all spill out, the divorce, the company, everything. Sarah listened intently, her eyes widening with every detail. When I finished, she reached across the table and gave my hand a firm squeeze. "Girl, you're free," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "And now you're the boss." I couldn't help but smile, though a hint of doubt lingered. "I don't know, Sarah. Can I really run a company? It feels so big." She raised an eyebrow and fixed me with her no-nonsense look. "Are you kidding me, Julia? You've been running that charity foundation like a seasoned pro for years. You're smart, you're organized, and most importantly, you actually care about people. You're going to be an incredible CEO." Her words hit me with the force of truth, filling me with a newfound confidence. Invigorated, I decided it was time to close another chapter, retrieving my belongings from Jack's house. Looking back, I realized I had never truly thought of it as my home. Now I understood why. When I arrived, I found Elizabeth sitting in the living room, looking frail and worn from her relentless battle with cancer. Her face, once so stern and guarded, was soft as she looked up at me. "Elizabeth," I began gently, "I'm here to collect my things. Jack and I were getting divorced." To my surprise, her eyes filled with tears. "Julia," she said, her voice trembling, "I know I haven't always been kind to you, but you've been so good to me. Would you consider taking me with you?" Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I was speechless. This woman who had once treated me like an outsider was now looking to me for help and kindness. I knelt beside her and took her hand. "Of course, Elizabeth," I said softly. "You can come with me." In her tearful smile, I saw gratitude and relief. For the first time, I realized that while my marriage to Jack was over, this bond, this connection, was something worth saving. I was stunned. "You want to come with me?" I asked, struggling to wrap my head around her request. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the front door slammed open. Jack stormed in, his face red with fury, radiating anger. "You," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "What the hell did you do? The company accounts are blocked. I can't access the money." I straightened my spine, meeting his glare without flinching. "That money was never yours, Jack," I said firmly. "Oh, and in case you hadn't figured it out yet, my father fired you 2 weeks before he passed. You have no claim to the company. None. And just so we're clear, I've already instructed security not to let you back in the building." Jack's face contorted in shock, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He stammered, grasping for a response, but then his gaze shifted. His eyes landed on Elizabeth, who was calmly packing a suitcase. "Mom," he said, his voice rising in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth turned to him, her expression heavy with sadness and resolve. "I'm going with Julia," she said simply. "I'm sorry, Jack, but you've proven yourself unreliable. I can't stay here anymore." Her words sent Jack into a full-blown meltdown. His face turned an even deeper shade of crimson, and he gestured wildly at her. "Unreliable? Me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "This is all your fault. You raised me to be this way, with your coddling and your constant expectations. You wanted perfection, and now you're calling me the failure?" He whirled back to me, his tone dripping with venom. "Fine," he spat. "Get out. Both of you. I don't need either of you." For a moment, I felt a pang of pity. The man standing before me wasn't the charming, if irresponsible, person I had once married. This angry, bitter figure had been swallowed by his own failures and insecurities. But I couldn't let that sway me. Not anymore. "Come on, Elizabeth," I said softly, turning away from Jack. "Let's get your things." Together, we packed her belongings, methodically ignoring Jack's ranting and raving as he hurled insults and blame. His shouting grew louder, but we tuned him out, focusing on the task at hand. The drive to my parents' house was quiet. Elizabeth, exhausted from the confrontation, dozed off in the passenger seat. I kept my eyes on the road, my emotions swirling in the silence. When we finally pulled up to the house, a lump formed in my throat. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be coming home without Mom and Dad there to greet me. "We're here," I said gently, reaching over to wake Elizabeth. She stirred, blinking groggily as I helped her out of the car. Once inside, I led her down the familiar hallway to my parents' room. Standing in the doorway, I felt an ache in my chest, but also a sense of peace. "This room is yours now," I said softly. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she took in the cozy, familiar space. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak through the emotion tightening my throat. "Yes," I said, nodding. I think they would have wanted it this way." Elizabeth looked at me for a moment, her eyes shining with gratitude, and then she gently squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Julia," she whispered. As she settled into the room, I stepped back into the hallway, letting the memories wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As I helped Elizabeth settle into my parents' home, I was overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions: grief for the loss of my parents, relief at being free from Jack, and uncertainty about what lay ahead. But beneath it all, there was a small glimmer of hope, a spark that told me I could build a new life from the wreckage. Taking over my dad's company felt like being thrown into the deep end of a pool without knowing how to swim. The first few months were a chaotic blur of meetings, financial reports, and sleepless nights. I had no choice but to learn fast, and I was determined not to fail. To help navigate the complexities of running a multi-million-dollar company, I hired Tom, a seasoned business consultant. His sharp mind and patient demeanor made him invaluable. "You've got good instincts, Julia," he told me more than once. "Trust them." Bit by bit, I began to find my footing. 6 months in, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The company's performance turned around, and I felt a surge of pride knowing that I was building on my father's legacy in a way that would have made him proud. Throughout it all, I never neglected the Cancer Foundation. In fact, my work there became even more meaningful to me. It was a connection to my past and a driving force for my future, grounding me when things felt overwhelming. Elizabeth's health steadily declined during those 2 years, and I poured myself into her care, determined to make her final days as peaceful as possible. To my surprise, we grew close, forging a bond one never thought possible. Old wounds healed as we spent hours talking, laughing, and reflecting. When the day came, I was by her side, holding her hand as she slipped away. "Thank you for everything, Elizabeth," I whispered through tears. She managed a weak smile, gently squeezing my hand before leaving this world in peace. I organized her funeral myself, ensuring every detail was perfect. As I expected, Jack didn't show up. But even knowing how far he'd fallen, his absence still stung. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected call from Mr. Henderson. "Julia, there's something you need to see. Can you come to my office?" he said, his tone serious. When I arrived, I was shocked to see Jack already there, a blonde woman draped over his arm like a trophy. He smirked at me, his usual arrogance on full display. "Well, if it isn't the little CEO," he sneered. "Don't worry, I'm just here to collect my inheritance. Mom and I might not have always seen eye to eye, but blood is thicker than water, right?" I bit my tongue, refusing to take his bait. Instead, I turned to Mr. Henderson, who cleared his throat and began reading Elizabeth's will. At first, Jack leaned back in his chair, brimming with confidence. But as Mr. Henderson continued, his smug grin faded. "And so," Mr. Henderson read, "I leave my house and all my savings to Julia Thompson, with the stipulation that the money be donated to the Cancer Foundation she so passionately supports." Jack's face turned crimson as disbelief gave way to rage. Meanwhile, tears sprang to my eyes. Elizabeth's final act of kindness left me overwhelmed. Jack sputtered, This can't be right. She was my mother." But Mr. Henderson calmly closed the will, his voice firm. "It's all in order, Mr. Caldwell. Her wishes are clear." As Jack fumed, I felt a deep sense of peace. Elizabeth had seen the truth in the end, and her generosity was a testament to the bond we'd built. It was her way of honoring not just me, but the work we had shared, and I would make sure her legacy lived on. Jack exploded, his face twisted with fury. "This is outrageous. She manipulated Mom. She's a fraud, a gold digger. She ruined my life, and now she's stealing my inheritance." His voice echoed through the office, but his girlfriend, visibly shaken, wasn't sticking around for the meltdown. "You said we'd be set for life with this money," she snapped, glaring at him. "I'm out of here." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her and leaving Jack sputtering in disbelief. As I turned to leave, I could still hear Jack's ranting echoing behind me, his angry words fading into the background as I walked away. But none of it mattered anymore. I felt light, free, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. Elizabeth's final gift wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about something much deeper, validation. She had seen me for who I was, acknowledged my worth, and chosen to honor me with her trust and love. With her blessing, I felt ready to leave the pain of the past behind me and embrace the life I had fought so hard to build. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt bright. And as I stepped out into the world, I knew I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward.